I've spent 15 years at the Riverside Wildlife Preserve, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence is the natural language of the wild. Humans talk because we're desperate to be understood. Animals? They just are. My name is Caleb, and my world usually revolves around dietary charts, enclosure maintenance, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 500 pounds of muscle and silver fur. That muscle belongs to Barrett. He's a western lowland gorilla, the king of Sector 4, and for the 3 years he's been here, he hasn't made a sound. Not a grunt, not a hoot, not a chest beat. He just watches with these deep amber eyes that seem to hold more history than any textbook I've ever read. The higher-ups at the zoo called him defective. They thought he had some kind of neurological trauma from his time in the wild before he was rescued from a poaching ring. But I knew better. Barrett wasn't broken, he was waiting. It was a Tuesday, late August, the kind of humid afternoon where the air feels like a wet wool blanket. I was doing the final rounds after the park had closed. The tourists were gone, leaving behind nothing but empty soda cups and the fading echoes of screaming kids. I stopped by Barrett's enclosure to toss him a few extra kale stalks. "Rough day, big guy?" I muttered, leaning against the cold steel of the observation railing. "Join the club. The board is talking about transferring you to a research facility in Ohio. They think you're a lost cause because you won't interact for the crowds." I turned to leave, my keys jingling at my hip. Wait. The word was heavy. It sounded like two tectonic plates grinding together, gravelly, deep, and vibrating with an effort that seemed to shake the very ground I stood on. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I'm dehydrated, I thought. The heat is finally getting to me. "Caleb, wait." This time I turned. Barrett was standing right against the reinforced glass. He wasn't hunched over. He was standing tall, his massive knuckles barely touching the grass. His eyes weren't those of a beast. They were focused. They were pleading. I dropped my clipboard. The plastic cracked on the concrete, but I didn't care. "Barrett," I whispered, my voice cracking. Did you just speak?" The gorilla took a slow, deliberate breath. His massive chest expanded, and for a second he looked less like an exhibit and more like a king in exile. "Help them," he rumbled. The English was accented with a wild, guttural tilt, but it was unmistakable. "The ones from the water. They are coming back. Help me. Tell them." I felt the blood drain from my face. My mind was racing. Was there a hidden speaker? A prank? But no one was here, and Barrett's lips had moved. His throat had flexed. "Who are you talking about, Barrett? Who is coming back?" He pressed a massive palm against the glass, right where my hand was shaking. "The children of the storm," he said, his voice growing clearer, more desperate. "They don't remember, but I do. I am not a pet. I am a witness." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that gravelly, tectonic voice echoing in my skull. I am a witness. The next morning, I was back at Sector 4 before the sun had even cleared the horizon. The park was silent, draped in a low silver mist. I didn't bring my clipboard this time. I brought a recorder and a heavy sense of dread. If I was losing my mind, I wanted proof. Barrett was waiting for me. He was sitting in the corner of his enclosure, shadowed by a massive artificial rock, his silver back turned to the security cameras. He knew where the blind spots were. That was my first clue that he wasn't just smart, he was calculating. "Barrett," I whispered, pressing my face to the glass. "Talk to me, please." He turned slowly. His movements weren't animalistic. They were weary, like an old man carrying the weight of the world.
He crawled closer, his massive face inches from mine, separated only by 2 inches of reinforced acrylic. "Caleb," he rumbled. The voice was smoother today, as if his vocal cords were remembering how to vibrate. "You believe?" "I don't have a choice," I admitted, my heart thumping. "How? How can you speak English?" Barrett closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were wet. "Before the cage," he began, his voice dropping to a low hum. "Before the men with the thunder sticks, there were the others, the ones with the books." He started to tell me a story that shouldn't have been possible. 10 years ago, deep in the Virunga Mountains, Barrett hadn't been a specimen, he had been a protector. A group of American researchers, linguists, and conservationists had set up a remote camp in his territory. "The woman," Barrett said, his massive finger tracing a circle on the glass. "Dr. Sarah. She didn't look at me like a beast. She spoke to me every day for years. She showed me the symbols. She made the sounds. She said, 'Barrett, the world is bigger than the forest. One day you will need to tell them our story.'" My breath hitched. I remembered a news report from a decade ago, a research team that had vanished in the Congo during a sudden violent coup. They were never found. "What happened to them, Barrett? To Sarah?" His jaw tightened, a flash of primal grief crossing his face. "The storm came, not rain, fire. Men with cold eyes. They took the others. They left me for dead." He paused, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "But I saved the small ones, the 2 tiny humans. I carried them through the Black Forest for 3 sons. I gave them to the village by the river. I gave them my silence to keep them safe." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a talking gorilla. This was a war hero. This was a guardian who had witnessed a massacre and chosen to stay silent to survive the trauma until now. "Why now?" I asked. "Why tell me this today?" Barrett leaned in so close his breath fogged the glass. "Because," he whispered, "one of the small ones, she is here at the gates. She is in danger, Caleb. The men who took Sarah, they have found her again." Just then, the heavy metal doors of the exhibit area creaked open. It was my supervisor, Marcus, and 2 men in dark, expensive suits I'd never seen before. They weren't zoo officials. They moved like predators. "Caleb," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing, "step away from the glass. These gentlemen are from the Global Heritage Initiative. They're here to expedite Barrett's transfer, right now."
Things were moving too fast. The 2 men in suits didn't look like scientists. They looked like hunters who had traded their camouflage for silk. They didn't look at Barrett with wonder. They looked at him like a piece of evidence that needed to be shredded. "Step back, Caleb," Marcus repeated, his voice tight. He was sweating despite the morning chill. "These gentlemen have the federal clearance. We're moving Barrett to a private facility for behavioral assessment. The transport truck is already at the loading dock." I looked at Barrett. His eyes were fixed on the men, a low, subsonic rumble vibrating in his chest that only I could hear. He wasn't scared. He was preparing. "He's not going anywhere," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I stood my ground between the suits and the glass. "This gorilla isn't just a specimen. He's a witness to what happened in the Congo 10 years ago. He knows about Dr. Sarah and the missing researchers." The taller man, a guy with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow named Vance, stopped dead. He exchanged a sharp look with his partner. "The keeper has a vivid imagination," Vance said, his voice as cold as a morgue slab. "Move him out of the way, now." Before I could react, the heavy security gates at the far end of the exhibit creaked open. A tour group, mostly early bird seniors and a few families, was being led through by a junior guide. Among them was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with a camera around her neck and a look of confused recognition on her face. Her name tag read Maya. The moment Barrett saw her, he didn't roar, he didn't charge. He simply pressed both palms against the glass and let out a sound that broke my heart. A soft, whimpering coo, the kind a mother makes for her child. Maya froze. Her camera slipped from her hands, dangling by the strap. She stared at Barrett, her eyes widening as if a vault in her memory had just been kicked open. "The shadow," she whispered. "The shadow that carried me through the trees." Vance's hand went to the inside of his jacket. I knew that move. He wasn't reaching for a badge. He was reaching for a silenced pistol. These weren't officials. They were the same mercenaries who had cleared out that camp a decade ago. They had spent 10 years cleaning up witnesses, and they had finally tracked down the last two. The girl who remembered too much and the silverback who had saved her. "Maya, run!" I yelled, lunging toward Vance. I didn't make it. The second man, a brute named Miller, shoved me hard against the railing. My head hit the metal with a sickening crack, and the world turned into a blur of gray and red. Through the haze, I saw Vance leveling his weapon at the girl. The crowd started to scream. Chaos erupted. But then, a sound louder than any gunshot ripped through the air. Crack, shatter. The reinforced glass, the 2-inch, thick, bulletproof acrylic exploded outward. Barrett hadn't just punched it. He had thrown his entire 500-pound frame through the structural weak point. Glass shards rained down like diamonds in the sun. Barrett landed on the concrete floor, a titan of fur and fury. He didn't go for the tourists. He didn't go for me. He stepped directly in front of Maya, shielding her body with his own. "Stop," Barrett roared. This wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command that shook the light fixtures. "No more fire. No more blood." The entire room went dead silent. Even Vance froze, his gun trembling in his hand. A gorilla had just spoken. A miracle had just happened in the middle of a city zoo. "Lower the weapon," Barrett rumbled, his voice dripping with ancient authority, "or the forest will take you back." The silence that followed was heavier than the humidity. Vance's hand shook as he looked into the eyes of a creature that shouldn't exist, a witness that could finally speak. "Drop it," I commanded, pulling myself up from the floor, my head throbbing. "The cameras are rolling. The tourists have their phones out. It's over, Vance. The whole world just heard him." Vance looked at the crowd, dozens of smartphones held up like digital shields. He knew he couldn't kill a miracle in daylight. He lowered his weapon, just as the zoo's heavy security team swarmed the room. The officials were tackled to the ground, their high-priced suits stained by the dust of the enclosure. Barrett didn't move. He stayed hunched over Maya, a living wall of silver and muscle. Maya reached out, her fingers trembling, and buried them in the thick fur of his shoulder. Tears streamed down her face. "You saved us," she whispered. "You really were there." "Always," Barrett rumbled, his voice softening to a gentle purr. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The Global Heritage Initiative was exposed as a front for a private mercenary group hired to cover up the illegal mining operation that had destroyed the Congo camp 10 years ago. Because of Barrett's testimony and the files Maya had unknowingly kept in her mother's old journals, the men responsible were finally brought to justice. Barrett wasn't sent to a lab. He was moved to a massive high-security sanctuary in the mountains, where he could live out his days in peace, no longer an exhibit, but a legend. I went with him, of course. He's my translator, his friend, and his student. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset over the ridge, Barrett looked at me. He hadn't spoken much since that day. He didn't need to, but he had one last thing to say. "Caleb," he said,
his voice like the wind through the trees. Humans, they have so many words, but they forget to listen. They think the world is silent because they do not know how to hear. The greatest wisdom doesn't always come from the loudest voices. We often mistake silence for a lack of intelligence, but true strength lies in knowing when to speak and having the courage to use your voice when it matters most. Sometimes the beasts among us are the ones who truly understand what it means to be human.